A star led them there, not a metaphor, not a poet's way of saying that hope guided their crossing, but an actual star, the brightest in the sky in those years, moving westward night by night across the vault of heaven, blazing with a light too steady and too purposeful to be weather or accident. They called it Gil Estel, the star of high hope, and they knew whose brow it marked. Eärendil, their kinsman, the half-elfin mariner, who had sailed beyond the circles of the world to beg mercy of the Valar on behalf of all the peoples of Middle-earth, and who now sailed the sky in his great ship, with the jewel of the First Age blazing on his brow, tracing his path across the dark, in service to the light. They followed it west. The Edain, the three great houses of men who had fought beside the elves through every catastrophe of the First Age, who had lost almost everything in those wars and had emerged from them diminished but unbroken. They followed the star across the sea on the greatest fleet they had yet built, sailing into waters that no mortal man had crossed, and that the songs of even the elves described only in the language of the forbidden and the unknown. They sailed for weeks, and then the sea before them changed its color and texture in the way that the sea changes when land is approaching, and out of the morning light, they saw it. The island was rising from the sea, or so it seemed. Rising was the word in the oldest accounts, as if they had arrived at the precise moment when the Valar were finishing what they had made, the ground still settling into its final form, the green of the upland meadows still gaining its permanent depth of color, the white foam of the newly established shorelines still deciding its permanent patterns against the new rock. The truth was simply that they had never been close enough to see a large island emerge from the horizon before, the way large things emerge at sea. Gradually, the highest points first, the mountain at the center of it appearing as a low cloud before it resolved into the peak of stone it actually was, and then the slopes spreading outward as the fleet drew closer, until the full shape of the land was visible. Enormous, immeasurably fertile, 5 great promontories reaching into the sea like the fingers of a hand extended in welcome. They called it Elena, starwards, the island they had been guided to by the star. They called it also Númenor, which meant the land of the west, and Andor, the land of gift, and each name was accurate in its own way, and none of them fully contained the fact of what they had been given, or what it would cost them in the end to lose it. The mountain at the center of the island was called Meneltarma, the Pillar of Heaven, and it rose from the middle of the land in the way that mountains rise when they mean something beyond their height, which is to say, you could see it from every coast, from every field and harbor and forest of the island, a constant vertical reference point against the sky, orienting everything around it the way a compass orients a ship. It was not simply the island's highest point, it was its axis. It was, in the understanding of the Númenóreans who came to revere it, the place on earth closest to what was above the earth, closest to Ilúvatar, the one above all, whose name they spoke 3 times a year in silence on the mountain's summit, once each at the beginning of spring and the beginning of summer and at the harvest's end, coming up the long paths from Armenelos below, with nothing in their hands and no words prepared, only the silence that is the fullest kind of speech. They built their city at the mountain's feet, Armenelos the Golden, That was what they eventually called it, though in the first generation it was simply the city, the one city, the settlement taking shape in the hills above the eastern plain, with the urgency and the ingenuity of a people who had survived enough to know exactly how they wanted to live. The Númenóreans were builders in the way that the dwarves were miners and the elves were singers. It was in their nature, the expression of who they were made in physical form, the thing they did when given materials and time and peace. The buildings they raised in Armenelos had a quality that ordinary building does not have, an understanding of how stone wanted to be used, a knowledge of proportion that came from the elvish teaching they had absorbed through the First Age, and a human energy and ambition that pushed the elvish elegance into something grander, something that announced the presence of a people with something to prove and the tools to prove it. The white towers rose. The harbour of Rómenna on the eastern shore grew into the greatest port in the world, a forest of masts and the smell of salt and new timber, and the complex, organized chaos of a civilization that had decided the sea was its primary instrument. They built ships first and always, ships above everything, ships before bridges and roads and palaces, because the sea was their origin story, and the sea was their future, and the sea was the language in which they most fully express who they were. Elros was their first king. He was the son of Erendil and Elwing, the grandson of Tuor and Idril, the grandson also of Beren and Luthien, a lineage that ran through the most significant unions in the history of the world, joining the blood of men and elves, and through Luthien, something older and stranger than either, the Maya heritage that had come through Melian into Luthien, and from Luthien into her children and their children's children. He and his brother Elrond were the last inheritors of this compounded heritage, and they had been given a choice that no one before them had been given, and that no one after them would be given: to be counted among the elves and receive the immortality of the Eldar, or to be counted among men and receive the gift of mortality that the elves sometimes called the gift of Ilúvatar, and sometimes, in darker moods, the doom. Elrond chose the elves. Elros chose men and went to the island and became Tar-Minotaur and ruled for 5 centuries. For the gift of his particular lineage was an extraordinarily long life, even among the long-lived Númenóreans. And in those 5 centuries he built the foundation of everything that followed, and the foundation was sound, and the building was beautiful, and the ending was not his fault. Picture the island in those first centuries, the forests running down to the sea on every coast, the rivers running clear over the stone of their own new beds, the fields spreading across the inland plains in the deep gold of grain that grows in good soil under a generous sky. The Númenóreans were the largest, the most gifted, the longest-lived of all men in the world, standing a full head or more above the tallest of ordinary men, moving with the easy authority of people who have never lived in the knowledge of scarcity, their dark hair and their clear eyes, and their faces carrying in them the unmistakable quality of something that has been given more than the ordinary provision and is aware of it. They were handsome in the way that health and security and the cultivation of all the arts produce handsomeness, not the raw material of good features, but the finished quality of a people for whom the arts of beauty were not luxuries, but practices as ordinary as farming. They could speak to birds and beasts in those early years, not as a trick, not as a special gift possessed by a few, but as a general faculty, the capacity to understand and be understood by the living world around them, to be in conversation with the island's creatures, rather than simply sharing the space. This gift diminished over the generations. By the middle centuries, it was largely lost, and by the later years, it was a legend, a story the old people told about how things had been, that the young people received with the specific skepticism of those who have never had something and find it difficult to believe that the having of it was as ordinary as the old people claim. The Valar were present in those early centuries, in the particular way the Valar were ever present in the inhabited world, not in person, not in form, but in the quality of the gift itself, in the health of the land and the productiveness of the sea, in the feeling that the island was not merely a geographical feature of the world, but a deliberate provision, a prepared place. The 3 prayers at Meneltarma were accepted, in the sense that rain fell and crops grew, and the sea gave what it was asked for. The Númenóreans felt themselves in right relationship with the powers of the world, and this feeling was not vanity, but accuracy. For the first several centuries, they were exactly what they were supposed to be. The elves came to them from Erendis, not frequently, not as permanent residents, but as visitors, bearers of gifts, teachers of lore, the living continuation of the friendship forged in the First Age Wars. The elves brought with them a white tree as a gift, a seedling from the tree of Tar-Aldarion, which was itself a seedling from Galathilion, the image of Tar-Aldarion the White Tree of Valinor, made by the Valar for the elves in the Elder Days. The elves called it Celeborn, the Silver Tree. The Númenóreans planted it in the courts of the king in Armenelos, and it grew, and it was called Nimloth the Fair, and it flowered in the evenings with a light faintly reminiscent of the moonlight it ultimately descended from. And it was the most beautiful living thing on the island, and it stood in the center of the king's court as the most visible, most daily reminder of where the Númenóreans had come from and whose friendship had made them what they were. The sea pulled at them. This was the first tension in the story, and it was a tension they could not have avoided because it was built into the nature of who they were. They were the greatest sailors in the world. The sea was their heritage and their passion and their art, and the sea, in every direction except one, was open to them, and in that one direction, west beyond the island of Tar-Aldarion, toward the undying lands, it was closed. The ban of the Valar. Do not sail so far west that you can no longer see the sky above Middle-earth. Do not seek the shores of Valinor. Not because the Valar feared you, they feared nothing, but because you are mortal, and the undying lands are not for mortal men, and to come there would be to die sooner than your time, burned by the light you could not survive. The first Númenóreans accepted this. The ban was part of the gift, the shadow that defined the light, and they were too grateful and too wise and too recently out of the wars to spend their gratitude on resentment about its conditions. They sailed east and south and north and west to the permitted limit, and what they found in those directions was enough, more than enough, more than any civilization before them had had to work with. They found Middle-earth. In those early centuries, Their coming to the shores of Middle-earth was benevolent. They came not as conquerors, but as benefactors, bringing knowledge of agriculture to the men who still lived by hunting and gathering, bringing the arts of metalwork and building and navigation, trading rather than taking, teaching rather than demanding.
The men of Middle-earth, who were mortal and short-lived, and who knew nothing of the long history of the elder days, looked at the Númenóreans who came off their great ships and saw beings of a different order, tall, long-lived, skilled, apparently immune to the ordinary ravages of time, speaking in tongues of such music and complexity that they were half believed to be gods. They were not gods. They were men given more than ordinary men receive, and for a time they used the more well. But the sea kept pulling, the western horizon kept calling, and the thing they were forbidden was the thing that accumulated the most significance, precisely because it was forbidden, as forbidden things do in the minds of intelligent and ambitious people.
Tar-Aldarion changed things. He was the 6th king of Númenor, and he was a mariner above everything, above being a king, above being a son, above being a husband, above any role the land and the life of the island pressed on him. He was lean and weather-dark, and perpetually restless in the way that people are restless when their natural element is somewhere they can only be part of the time, when the necessary periods of being elsewhere accumulate into a kind of sustained longing that sharpens everything in him to a single edge.
He loved the sea with a completeness that left insufficient room for anything else he was supposed to love, and the people around him spent years learning this at personal cost.
He founded the Guild of Venturers. He organized the great voyages, systematic, ambitious, pushing further than any previous generation had gone in the directions the ban permitted. He charted coastlines that had no names. He found peoples that had no knowledge of the wider world. He established the first permanent Númenórean havens on the shores of Middle-earth, small at first, then growing, the beginning of what would become Pelargir and the other great cities of the Númenórean presence in the east. His wife was Erendis. She loved him the way that people love the things that will not stay, with an intensity proportional to the degree to which the loved thing keeps leaving, an intensity that accumulates with each departure until it becomes something that the heart can only barely contain, and that has nowhere to go when the subject of it comes home, except into forms the subject finds difficult and the lover finds inevitable. She hated the sea. She hated it not as a person hates an abstraction, but as a person hates a rival, specifically with full knowledge of what she was up against and full awareness that she was losing. She waited on the western shore of Númenor, at Emerië, the inland sheep pastures where she had made her home in deliberate opposition to everything the sea represented, a life of the settled and the rooted and the quiet, a life Tar-Aldarion could not understand as a genuine preference and kept trying to persuade her out of. She waited through long years of his voyages. She waited while her daughter Anancalimë grew without a father. She waited while the word was sent that he was delayed, then further delayed, then returning, and then not returning after all. They parted, not dramatically, not with the clean rupture of a single breaking point, but in the gradual, grinding way that marriages part when the two people within them want incompatible things and have been wanting them long enough that the wanting has become the defining fact of each life, and the marriage has become the frame around two separate lives rather than the center of a shared one. Erendis withdrew to Emerië and raised Tar-Ancalimë in deliberate isolation from the court and from the sea. Tar-Aldarion went back to the water. Tar-Ancalimë succeeded him, the first ruling queen of Númenor, Tar-Ancalimë, and she was her mother's daughter in many ways and her father's daughter in others, and she ruled for a long time, and the accounts of her reign are the accounts of a complex person who had inherited the best and the worst of two irreconcilable inheritances.
She was brilliant and difficult and deeply private, and did not want a husband, and resisted the pressure for one with a determination that the court found alarming and the succession required. And she eventually compromised by finding the worst possible husband she could locate, which solved the problem of producing an heir while ensuring that the marriage was too unpleasant to be any kind of distraction from the work.
Generations passed. The island grew in wealth, and the kingdom grew in reach, and the ships grew in size, and the harbours grew in complexity, and everything grew, except the one thing that was not permitted to grow: the lifespans. The Númenóreans lived longer than ordinary men, yes, much longer, decades beyond the reach of ordinary human aging, centuries for the kings. But they did not live forever. They died as all men died, and the more they achieved in their long lives, the more clearly they could see everything that could be achieved if only the lives were longer, and the more clearly they could see it, the more keenly they felt the approaching limit.
The elves came less frequently as the centuries passed. The elves were not avoiding the Númenóreans. The friendship was genuine on both sides, but something in the quality of the Númenórean relationship to the friendship was changing, and the elves felt it. They still came to Tol Eressëa, and the Númenóreans could still sail to Eressëa, but the ease of the earlier period was becoming something more careful, more deliberate, shadowed by the awareness that the thing the Númenóreans most wanted was the thing the elves had and could not give. Immortality. The word had always been in the room. The elves had it, the Valar had it. Every significant power in the world except men had it. The world was filled with beings who would not die, who would walk in it until the end of everything, who would see every consequence of every choice they made, who had the time to be everything they could be. And men were given 3 generations and a diminishing body, and the certainty that everything they built would be inherited by people who would not be them. The Númenóreans began, slowly, in the long centuries around the middle of the Second Age, to call this unjust. The shift did not happen in a single reign or with a single decision. It happened the way the silting of a river happens, grain by grain, too slow to observe directly, until one day you look at the water and realize that it has changed course in the night without your noticing. The public worship at Meneltarma became less frequent. The reverence in it became more formal, more performance than prayer. The silence on the summit losing its quality of genuine listening and becoming instead the silence of a people going through motions they had inherited and no longer fully believed. The white tree still stood in the courts of the king, its flowers opening in the evenings with the ghost light of their distant origin, and the kings still paid it the formal respect its history demanded, but the love in the respect was thinning. The ban became the center of a resentment that had been looking for a focus.
Why were they forbidden to sail west? What were the Valar afraid of, that they had to keep the most gifted of all men confined to one direction of the sea? The question was being asked differently now, not as genuine inquiry, but as accusation, not wondering, but asserting, and the assertion had an answer already prepared. The Valar feared men. The Valar kept men mortal because immortal men would surpass them. The ban was not protection, but jealousy, the jealousy of lesser powers for greater ones, the cage that the Valar built around the one people who might have challenged them if given time enough to grow.
This was not true, but it was a story that fit the shape of the resentment, and stories that fit the shape of resentments do not require truth in the ordinary sense, because they are true to the feeling, which is the only truth that resentment asks for.
The king's men crystallized. They were the majority party, the great faction of Númenórean nobility and merchant power that had decided the old reverence was weakness. The friendship with elves was a relationship between unequals that the lesser party could afford to resent, and the ban of the Valar was an insult masquerading as protection. They did not become this all at once. They became it the way everything becomes something, through a series of choices that each seemed reasonable at the time, each one making the next one easier, each departure from the old way making the old way seem more distant and more foreign, until those who remembered it as a living practice were simply fewer and older every decade.
The faithful were the minority, scattered, increasingly pressed, holding to the old friendship with the elves and the old reverence for the Valar and the old language of their prayers, with the specific stubbornness of people who can see clearly what is happening around them and have decided that clarity is not sufficient reason to go along with it. They were concentrated most strongly in the western ports, in Andunia on the coast that faced Erendis, where the elvish ships still occasionally put in, and where the memory of the original gift was strongest, in the architecture and the customs and the families that had maintained the old ways across the generations.
The lords of Andunia were the leaders of the faithful, and they held to what they knew through the long centuries of increasing pressure. And the line of Andunia was the line that would eventually produce Elendil and his sons, and Elendil's sons would produce Aragorn, and so the thing the faithful held in the west of a doomed island was the thing that remade the world at the end of the Third Age, though no one standing in the western port watching the king's men's persecution of everything they valued could have known this and been comforted by it. The kings in the middle centuries of the island's history bear the mark of the conflict between these factions in their names and in their lives. The choosing of a regnal name was a statement. Those who chose names in Quenya, the tongue of the elves, were declaring allegiance to the old ways. Those who chose names in Adûnakhôr, the native Númenórean tongue, were declaring independence from them. As the king's men grew in power, the Quenya names gave way, and the change was felt because names are not decoration, they are orientation.
Ar-Adûnakhôr was the king who formalized the suppression. He took his name in Adûnakhôr, which was the first time a king had done so, and he made the use of elvish tongues in public a punishable offense. The faithful, who prayed in Quenya and kept their law in Sindarin, and whose friendship with the elves expressed itself in language as much as in anything else, became outlaws in the practice of their most essential habits. They did not abandon the practices. They moved them inward, into private homes, into the quiet conversations of those who could be trusted, into the particular small heroisms of people who maintain the truth in whispers, because the truth has become dangerous to speak aloud.
The white tree bloomed in the evenings in the courts of a king who had no interest in it. Tar-Palantir came later like a held breath, like the pause before a sentence changes direction. He was the 24th king, and he had the gift of foresight, which was itself a kind of mercy and a kind of torture. The ability to see where things were going is not useful if you cannot change where things are going, and Tar-Palantir could see and could not change, and spent his reign in the particular anguish of a person watching a disaster unfold slowly, with full foreknowledge and insufficient power. He climbed Meneltarma again. He repented the way of his fathers and stood on the summit in silence and called out to Ilúvatar in the old forms, and whether the call was received in any way that Tar-Palantir himself could feel is not recorded, but what is recorded is what he said, that the white tree would stand as long as the line of the kings stood, and when the white tree died, the line would die with it. He said this knowing the tree was at risk. He said it as a warning, and perhaps as a last attempt to give the tree's survival a political weight that pure reverence had lost.
He had no son. He had a daughter, Míriel. And when Tar-Palantir died, his nephew Ar-Pharazôn, son of his brother Gimilcard, the king's men faction's most powerful representative of his generation, forced Míriel to marry him and took the scepter. This was the beginning of the end. Not because it was the first wrong thing, but because it was the wrong thing from which there was no turning back. The seizure of royal authority by force, the violation of the succession law, the marriage made without consent, in defiance of every principle the old law of Númenor had held. All the previous wrongs had been wrongs committed within the system, corruptions of the system from inside. This was the system broken. And once the system was broken, the question of what would replace it was answered immediately by the man who had broken it.
Ar-Pharazôn the Golden. He was the greatest king Númenor had known in terms of raw capability and personal magnetism and military power. The accounts are specific about this, and they are not flattering about anything else. He was tall as a tower, dark-haired, his face a face that inspired devotion or terror without much space between them, carrying in his bearing the absolute certainty of someone who had never experienced doubt and had interpreted this absence as evidence of correctness rather than limitation.
He was old and growing older when he took the throne. The irony built into his story is precise, because the man most terrified of death was the one man in the world most visibly in possession of everything that death would take.
He gathered his fleets, and he sailed to Middle-earth to humble Sauron. The timing of this was the Second Age's great pivot. Sauron had been building his power in Mordor and his influence over the peoples of Middle-earth for centuries. His armies had spread south and east, and the Númenórean captains who came to Middle-earth's shores were sending back reports of a darkness gathering that required more than a military garrison.
Ar-Pharazôn received these reports and decided on a response proportional to his own significance. He would go himself with the greatest fleet ever assembled.
The fleet that gathered at Rómenna harbour in the year 3261 of the Second Age was beyond the capacity of adjectives to handle adequately. The accounts use numbers, hundreds of ships, thousands of men, but the numbers are less evocative than the image. The harbour so full of masts that it looked from the hills above it like a forest grown from water. The air thick with the smell of pitch and salt and the sounds of provisioning. The roads from every part of the island carrying the last supplies of the greatest expedition in human history to the coast.
Ar-Pharazôn stood at the harbour's edge in his armour, black and gold, the sun on it bright enough to serve as its own beacon, and looked at what he had assembled, and did not doubt for a moment that it was sufficient.
He landed at Umbar, and the darkness fled before him. Sauron's armies, which had been spreading like a shadow across the coasts of Middle-earth, which had made the inhabitants of those coasts live in the specific crouching terror of people who know the darkness is coming and do not know when, dispersed when the Númenórean fleet appeared on the horizon. Not in the face of actual combat. They had not yet reached combat. The sight of it was enough. The sight of Ar-Pharazôn's host was sufficient to make armies that had terrorized whole regions melt back into the east. And Sauron's servants sent word to their master that the host of Númenor had come, and that the numbers were beyond contesting.
Sauron looked at his forces and looked at the host on the shore and made a calculation. He could not win a military engagement. The Númenórean forces were simply too many and too skilled and too well equipped for his current strength to overcome directly. He had been building for a very long time in Middle-earth, but he was not yet strong enough for this, which meant that direct resistance was not the path to the outcome he wanted, and the path to the outcome he wanted was one that did not require him to be powerful enough to win a fight.
He could surrender. He let Ar-Pharazôn come to him, came down from his stronghold in humility and apparent submission, came before the greatest king in the world and acknowledged the king's power and placed himself in the king's authority, allowed himself to be taken back to Númenor as a hostage. He stepped onto the ship willingly. He left Middle-earth and all his preparations behind. He gave up everything he had built in exchange for access to the inside of the thing he wanted to destroy from within.
The accounts do not describe his physical form in this period in precise detail, but what they do describe is its effect. He was beautiful, still at this stage capable of the fair form that the Second Age had given him, tall, luminous, apparently wise, carrying in his bearing the ease of someone at home with knowledge, and entirely willing to share it. He was the most compelling person in every room he entered, and the room he entered over the following years was the court of Númenor's last king. Within 3 years, he was Ar-Pharazôn's chief counselor. He moved through the court with the patience of something that had all the time it needed, and the specific intelligence of something that had been studying the vulnerabilities of its targets for longer than the targets had been alive. He found the fear. The fear was always there, in every Númenórean, and they came most of all, the fear that had been growing for centuries, the fear that was the dark side of the long life and the grand civilization and the unparalleled achievement, the approaching end of it, the knowing that all this would stop.
He spoke to it, not harshly, not with the dramatics of someone trying to convince, but with the gentle, sustained pressure of someone who is only pointing out what you already believe, only organizing into language the thing that your own experience has been saying to you for years. He said, "The Valar are not gods. They are powerful beings who have claimed a privilege they were not given the right to give themselves. They keep the gift of endless life in their country in the West, and they keep men away from it, not because of your limitation, but because of their fear. They know what men could be.
They have seen you build the greatest civilization in the history of the world, with nothing but the ordinary span of 3 long human lives. And they know what you would build with centuries, with millennia, with the full reach of what this civilization could be if it were not cut short by the accident of mortality."
He said, "Melkor knows the truth of this. The one the Valar cast out, the great power who was punished for telling men the truth about their captivity. He was cast out precisely because he offered freedom, and the Valar's authority depends on men remaining unfree." He said, "Ilúvatar is a story the Valar invented to make the cage seem moral. There is no one above them. There is no authority to which they must answer. Their power is real, but their authority is self-appointed, and the man who is willing to say so, who is willing to sail to the west and take what the Valar have kept from men by force, that man would not be punished by a non-existent god. That man would be immortal." None of this was true. Every word of it was a lie, calibrated to the specific wound it was intended to enter. But it was true to the feeling, true to the accumulated resentment of centuries of watching the elves leave the world for a home men were not permitted to have, true to the bitterness of living longer than ordinary men and still not long enough, true to everything that the shadow of the ban had been casting over the island since the first Númenóreans looked west and were told, "Not there." Ar-Pharazôn believed it the way a drowning man believes the thing that offers a handhold, which is to say, with his whole body and without examining the thing closely. The temple went up on Meneltarma first. Sauron directed its construction, and the accounts of it are the accounts of something designed to be the opposite of what the mountain had been. Where the summit had been open to the sky, the temple was enclosed. Where the worship had been silence, the temple was filled with sound and smoke. Where the prayers had been addressed upward, the sacrifice was directed downward, to the shadow, to the power of darkness that Sauron was presenting as the real power behind the world. It was a vast dome of black metal, its walls thick enough to muffle the sound of what happened inside from those who stood close to it on the mountain slopes. The fires inside it burned without the warmth of ordinary fire. They were the fires of offering, and what was offered in them was human, and the smoke that rose from the temple crown into the sky of Númenor was visible from the harbour of Rómenna on clear days, and was the wrong colour for any wood, any grain, any innocent thing. The faithful were the first to be offered. Not all of them, not immediately, not with the organizational thoroughness of a systematic persecution. That came later, as the logic of sacrifice requires more sacrifice to maintain the impression that the previous sacrifice produced the desired result. In the beginning, it was selective, targeted, with a specific intent of terrorizing the remainder rather than eliminating the whole. A name would be taken, a family removed, a house that had maintained the elvish custom for generations, suddenly no longer present in the morning.
The faithful understood what was happening, and they gathered their most essential possessions and their most essential selves, and they waited.
Isildur went for the white tree. The fruit of Nimloth the Fair, the fruit from which a new white tree could be grown, the continuation of the line that ran back through Celeborn and Galathylion to Telperion itself, was still on the tree in the courts of the king when Sauron moved to have the tree felled and burned. The tree had been Tar-Palantir's ward, and its survival had been his prophecy's subject, and with the last faithful king dead and his daughter married to a tyrant, the tree had no protector.
Isildur was the son of Elendil, who was the son of Amandil, who was the lord of Andúney and the leader of the faithful, the direct heir of a line that had maintained the old friendship through every generation of suppression. He was young and bold, and he went alone at night into the courts of the king, with everything against him. The accounts say he was wounded severely by the guards, by the encounter with whatever protections the king's court maintained around its central monument. He was hurt badly enough that the accounts record it as a near thing, a rescue achieved at the edge of what survival allows. He came back with the fruit in his hands and collapsed at his father's door, and was carried inside and healed slowly over the following weeks. And while he healed, the tree was cut down. The tree was burned as an offering in the temple, and the smoke of it was different from the smoke of the other offerings, brighter and smelling of something clean and old, and it rose straight up through the temple's smoke crown without the oiliness that characterized the offerings made to the shadow. And even those who had accepted everything else felt something move in them when the tree's smoke went up, something that was the last trace of what they had been before the shadow settled, a grief older than the choices that had led to this moment. The prophecy was in motion. Ar-Pharazôn grew old and felt it, grew old in the specific accelerating way that old age arrives when you have spent your life in fear of it, rushing in the last years, the years you spent your whole life thinking would not reach you yet, arriving early and insistent and impossible to ignore. He looked at his hands in the morning and saw the hands of an old man, and felt what the greatest king in the world feels when he discovers that greatness has not, after all, protected him from the ordinary failure of the body. He was afraid in the way that people who have been very powerful are afraid of death, not merely afraid of ending, but afraid of what it means, that all this power could not prevent it.
Sauron was waiting for exactly this. The great armament was assembled. The fleet that had humbled Sauron at Umbar was a minor gathering compared to what Ar-Pharazôn assembled now, which was the full expression of a civilization's 3,000 years of shipbuilding tradition applied to a single apocalyptic purpose. Ships so numerous that the harbour of Rómenna could not hold them, and they spread along the eastern coast for miles in either direction. men in numbers sufficient to populate a kingdom, supplies for a campaign without specified end.
Every piece of material wealth that the greatest material civilization in history could bring to bear on the problem of taking immortality from those who had kept it.
They sailed west in the year 3119 of the Second Age, Ar-Pharazôn at the head of the fleet in his greatest ship, his armor still gold and black, though his face beneath the helmet was the face of a very old man, the face of what the quest was really about, visible to anyone who looked directly at it, rather than at the golden armor. The fleet moved west in the morning light, with the specific terrible beauty of things that are wrong at the deepest level, but are executed with complete competence. Every ship perfect, every sail set correctly, every formation maintained. The greatest naval achievement in the world's history, in service of the world's greatest mistake.
The shores of Valinor came to them out of the west. The undying lands, which had been the horizon's permanent suggestion, the forbidden goal, the thing that had shaped the whole of Númenórean civilization by its presence as an absence, they became visible, rising from the sea ahead of the fleet, green and silver, and lit with a light that was different from the light of the ordinary world, more complete, more settled, as if the sun that illuminated everything else was a copy, and this was the original. Ar-Pharazôn landed. He planted his standard on the shores of Valinor in the name of men, and declared his right to the gift of endless life, and challenged the power that had withheld it. Manwë went to the mountain. On the highest peak of the Pelori, the great mountains that guarded the western shore of Valinor, Manwë the elder king stood and called upon Ilúvatar in a manner beyond what the ordinary functioning of the world required. He laid down his guardianship of the world. He placed the management of what was about to happen into the hands of the one above him, because what was about to happen was not something that the Valar could manage with the authority they had been given. It required something above their authority.
Ilúvatar moved. The accounts try to describe this and almost succeed. The sea gaped. Not in the way of a storm, not in the way of waves working on the geometry of a coastline, but in the way of the fundamental structure of things obeying a will more primary than the will that usually governs them. The sea opened, and the fleet of Ar-Pharazôn was taken in, swallowed, removed from the world into the darkness under it, the ships and the men and the golden armor and the old king's face beneath the gold, gone, in a matter that the accounts describe as rapid and complete, and impossible for the fleet behind to prevent or escape.
Númenor went into the sea. The island, the 5-pointed, mountain-crowned, 3,000-year-old gift from the Valar to the faithfulness of the Edain, with its forests and its harbours and its fields and its towers, and Armenelos where the white tree had bloomed, and the temple where it had burned, went down. The sea closed over it. The wave that ended it was not a wave in the ordinary sense, but the shape that the world's correction took, a return of what had been given when the giving was violated, the physical expression of the fact that the gift could not be kept by those who had become something that should not have been trusted with it.
The world was changed. The flat world, The world in which, if you sailed far enough in the right direction, you could approach the shores of the undying lands from the physical sea, was made round. The undying lands were removed from the circles of the world and placed outside them, accessible only to those permitted to use the straight road, which was a path that still ran west through the air above the curvature of the new world, but was invisible and unnavigable by any ship built of mortal materials. The sea now curved away from Valinor. You could sail west forever and arrive in the east, and the horizon that used to carry the suggestion of something beyond it now carried only the suggestion of the world continuing in a circle back to where it started. Sauron's body was destroyed in the wave. He had been on the island. He had stayed, not on the ships, not going west with the armada he had engineered, remaining instead in his tower on Númenor, with what he had arranged to keep safe, while the expendable parts of the plan went ahead. But the plan's failure was on a scale he had not modelled. The whole island went. The tower and the temple and the capital and every other structure went with it, and Sauron's physical form, the beautiful, capable, silver-tongued form that had corrupted a civilization, was destroyed in the sinking, and the fair form was gone forever. He had lost the ability to appear beautiful or benign in the drowning of the island he had poisoned.
9 ships ran before the storm. The wave that sank Númenor sent a wall of water east ahead of it, and on that wall, driven faster than any wind had ever driven them, 9 ships of the faithful were carried to the shores of Middle-earth. Elendil had prepared them. Amandil, his father, had warned him, had set sail himself into the west before the armament departed, hoping to reach Valinor by a route the armament was not taking, hoping to beg mercy for those who had remained faithful in the way that Erendil had begged mercy at the First Age's end. Amandil was never seen again.
What mercy existed for the faithful arrived not because of his voyage, but in spite of everything. In the survival of the 9 ships on the back of the wave that destroyed everything else. Elendil stood on the eastern shore of Middle-earth and looked back at the horizon, and there was nothing there. The island was gone. The civilization was gone. The king's courts and the harbours and the farms and the libraries and the craftsmen and the long history. 3,000 years of the greatest human civilization the world had known, gone in the time it takes a wave to finish. He had 9 ships. He had his sons, Isildur, who had saved the fruit of the white tree, and Anarion, who had helped manage the impossible logistics of the preparation. He had the Palantiri, the 7 seeing stones made by Feanor in the elder days, and brought to Númenor and preserved through the drowning as the most essential instruments of kingship. He had the Ring of Barahir, the heirloom of the House of Beor from the First Age, passed down through the generations to this moment. He had the seedling of Nimloth, still alive, carried in its pot through the storm that had killed everything else. That was what survived. Not the towers or the harbours or the libraries or the white city at the mountain's feet. Not the fleets, not the craftsmen, not the long memory of 3,000 years of civilization. A seedling in a pot, 7 stones wrapped in cloth, 9 ships running east on the back of the wave that swallowed everything else. It was enough to begin again. Whether it would be enough to mean something, that was a question the wave left unanswered, receding into the west over the place where the island had been, leaving behind only water and silence and the grey horizon of a world that had just been changed forever. The story of what those 9 ships carried and what became of it across the long centuries that followed. That is another story, and it begins on the eastern shore. The sea above Númenor is calm. It has been calm for 3,000 years, the ordinary calm of deep water above old ground, with nothing to show from the surface what is below it. The shape of the harbour is down there somewhere, filled with silt. The stones of Armenelos are down there. The mountain is down there, in the dark. Above it, the sea moves in the ordinary way of deep water above drowned stone. It gives nothing back. What was carried out, the seedling, the stones, the faith of those who refused to let it all go down, that is somewhere else now, further east, still alive.